Hey everybody, Coach Stacy here with Allie, and we are continuing to work on preparing our brain for competition. This week, we're talking about cue words. Now, a lot of you probably use cue words, know cue words. Um, that's amazing. For those of you who don't, we're going to start out with a more simple explanation, and then we're going to get into a little bit more advanced on it. So if you're familiar with it, stick around. You're still probably going to pick up some things. So what we're trying to do is throughout the whole month, we're building what we like to call internally as our meet mindset routine. So basically, you're at a meet and you have your choreography, you have your regular routine that you do. You're also going to have a routine that you do on what you focus your brain on and what you specifically think every single time. And we like to start preparing them now so that they can be practicing that when they're doing their routines in the gym, but they can also be visualizing, practicing those things. So we started the first week with learning how to visualize. Then we went last week where we worked on creating an affirmation that would create the emotional fuel that they need to take the actions. So we have our thought model that we use as our main foundational thing, and the thought creates the feeling. The feeling fuels the actions. So, in this, the affirmation is kind of the thought that's going to create the feeling. And then from there, now we're going to use cue words to really focus in on the specific actions that you need to take. Now, Allie, I know that we talked a lot about this with visualization, but just a quick, brief thing, talking about um, the difference between muscle memory and then when your brain needs to actually, or when your brain needs to actually give your body instructions on what to do. Because that's really what cue words are. Cue words are literally reminding your brain what instructions to give your body. But a lot of times gymnasts tell us, I just don't want to think. I just need to trust my training and not think. And there's truth to that with muscle memory, and there's also not truth. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so just quickly, if you have not listened to the visualization, I would listen to that one because I nerd out a little bit more on the whole process. But when we think of muscle memory, it's not actually your muscles that remember what to do. It is a motor program in your brain that sends electrical signals to your muscles telling them what to do. So what happens is you have a whole motor pattern that gets triggered and sent. And when you have muscle memory, that pattern is pretty automatic. Okay. And honestly, it can get to the point where they just say what skill they're going to do and it'll happen. But those are skills that they're super confident in, skills they've done for a long time. They've competed successfully. They have past evidence of doing. So, it actually is pretty rare for you to be able to compete a skill with having no thought at all. And even with that being said, it still is usually triggered by some sort of thought. So, even if it's just the skill name. And so, when we talk about cue words, this idea is to be able to take one word that helps trigger the motor pattern that you actually want to happen. And so, I like to give an example of when I vaulted. I did hand fronts and I got corrections, all the time, like everybody does. And a lot of my corrections were getting my hands into the table quicker and getting my heels coming over faster. Shocker, right? But if I thought about getting my hands into the table, I would drop my chest and I would do crazy things. And if I thought about driving my heels, sometimes I'd get all archy. And I found that my cue word, squeeze my butt, is one thing that I could physically do, an action that I could take that my brain was like, yeah, I know how to do that. I can easily do that. That would make my heels get up quicker and get my hands into the table quicker. And so our whole goal here is what happens is we have lots and lots and lots of things that we feel like are super important in order to do a skill successfully, but our brain can't think of all of those things at one time. And so being able to find one cue word that's going to trigger that motor pattern that you actually want, that's going to create that successful outcome is going to be super helpful. And then the more you practice it, the more consistent you get in it. Because eventually, by my senior year on all my events, I could probably still walk through an entire routine of affirmation through keywords. And so it's just really interesting how that works out. And once you find something successful, then you start believing in it and you believe it's successful and it keeps happening. So We're gonna talk a little more into, like, how to break it down and find that keyword because sometimes you get stuck. You're like, "I tell this gymnast this all the time." And so, Stacey, why don't you tell them a little more about, the process we use?
Yeah. So let's take something simple like vault. On something simple like vault, you're going to have a lot fewer keywords, right? It happens really quickly. It's less complex. On a beam routine, you might have an entire routine of keywords. You might have a keyword for every move on beam or just every skill. You really can kind of decide what works for you and how you want to teach that. Like, I was mostly a beam coach, so when I think of keywords, it's an entire, like, every skill has a keyword, but I know that's not necessarily, like, um, helpful on every event. So, one of the first things that we do to help them get down to their keyword is we ask them, like, what's like 3 things that you need to do on this skill? 3 to 5. What are the most important things that you need to do on this skill? And they'll give me some. And then I'm like, okay, if you had to pick one, what's the most important thing that you think you need to do? And they'll give us a actual thing. And a lot of times, because we're mindset coaches, at least for me, they'll be like, well, I need to think positive. Well, I just need to be confident. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like, physical action you need to do. And so then a lot of times they'll be like, well, I need to square my hips. And I'm like, how do you square your hips? Like, what do you need to do? Oh, I need to pull my left hip back, or oh, I need to push straight through both feet, or oh, I need to push equally off whatever it is. They'll come up with their own versions of what it is they need to do that thing. And then I'm like, okay, now let's give it a code. What's one word that makes you think of doing that action? And they'll come up with that one word and then they'll start using that. And then we just tell them to try it out. This is the month where you're testing out some different keywords to see what works on your different skills. So it's like Allie said, like she could have been like, well, the most important thing is I need to get my hands to the table. So her keyword could have been hands or fast hands or something. But she tried that. That didn't work. Then it was like the next most important was like feet, fast feet or feet up or something like that. She tried that. It didn't work. Then it was like squeeze butt. That worked. And so
Mhm.
this is the time where you want to help them experiment to figure out what's the cue word that actually really helps them do the thing they need to do. And then sometimes the thing they think they need to do isn't actually
Mhm.
the thing they need to do or the most helpful, but we found it's most helpful when they come up with it, and then if they try it, then they're like, "Oh, that turns out that didn't work." Then they try another one, but when their brains come up with some of the weirdest things that you wouldn't think will work, and they do. So, like, again, like, yeah, did we think that it's important for Allie to squeeze her butt? Sure. But, like, that's probably not the first correction I would have thought about giving her as her coach. And, we used to have a friend who talked about pushing through her big toe, like on a back handspring. If she pushed through her big toe, that's what worked. Like, there's just things where your brain makes associations that make sense to you. And so letting your gymnast pick out what those are is going to be super helpful. So we ask 3 to 5 things, then we ask them to give us one main thing, then we figure out the word that's going to help them think about that thing.
Yeah, and I just wanna bring up too, sometimes they bring up a general idea, like straightening their legs, and so when it's really broad, sometimes our brain is like, "Yeah, I know how to straighten my legs, but I don't know how to straighten my legs in a series." Like, it doesn't think it knows how to do that. So sometimes coming up with, like, the actions that help you do that can help them get to a one word too, because a lot of times they'll be like, straight legs. That's gonna be my cue. Straight legs. But their like brain doesn't when it says straight legs, that part that is not sent. Their brain it has a disconnect with their body. So a lot of times it's not that they're not listening to you or they're not trying. Just sometimes there's a disconnect. Like as a coach, do you ever go to camp and then like a different coach says like the exact same thing as you, and then all of a sudden the gymnast is like, oh, huh, and then all of a sudden they can do it. Well, usually there's just something so minor, like a little tweak in words that allows their brain to be like, "Oh." I know how to do that, and it switches, and then it's able to do it. So even like minor things like that, minor word changes and little things, that's why we like them to bring it up, because when their brain comes up with it, usually it's something they already believe and they think that they can do, then it makes it easier for that connection to happen. And so it's kind of just like that idea of the other coach that tells them something and it works. They're just telling themselves now. And when they feel like they can't do it, I wouldn't go straight to anything other than, okay, what action? So, like when you're coaching a girl and you want her to straighten your legs and you figure out the actions, you all go to squeeze your quads, right? And then the girls are like, "Oh, I can squeeze my quads." And you have them sit down and squeeze that muscle and like they can feel their legs actually getting tighter and straighter. And then you're like, "Do you feel that when you do that skill?" And they're like, "No." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, what if we just try and feel that same thing and actually squeeze that one muscle?" And so even like sometimes they're like, "I don't even know how I do it." I make them do another one, be like, "Okay, come tell me 3 different muscles you use to make that happen." And then they'll come back and be like, "Oh, my abs and my whatever." I'm like, "Oh, like, what did that feel like?" So, getting ribs down, I had a girl that we got to mini crunch. 'Cause, like, to pack down her ribs, like, if you're laying on your back and you're just doing that action felt like a mini crunch to her, and she was like, "I can do a mini crunch. That's no problem. That's easy." So, trying to get a girl's ribs in for years and, like, "Get your ribs in, get your ribs in, pack your ribs down," for years turned into mini crunch, and all of a sudden it was magical. So,
Yeah.
just don't be afraid to, like, just experiment with that kind of stuff because it's amazing what the brain can do and the connections it makes sending to the body.
Yeah. And even with that, remembering different people's learning styles. Like some people learn visually, some people learn auditory, some people learn kinesthetically. And so they may need to see something to come up with a word and then be able to associate the word with what they see. They may need to feel something, they may need to hear something. Visual and kinesthetic are much more likely. Um, not likely. They're like they're the more common learning styles in our current society. And so, even that of like sometimes it's helpful to get them to see it. But cue words, I also like to talk to kids about their like code words, or they're the summary, or they're the key that like unlocks the whole thing. And so sometimes I'll talk to them about imagining an entire painting, and then I want you to like put details into that painting. There's mountains and there's trees, and there's a sky and there's a bird and there's a lake and there's waves and there's this whole thing. And then there's a red canoe. And then they pick one word that describes the whole picture to them. A lot of times it's actually a color for pictures. So they'd be like red. And every time they say red, now they can see that entire painting. And so that's how I'll describe to them your keyword is kind of like your code. It's kind of like your key. It's the one word that helps you see the whole bigger picture. So you might just say squeeze your butt, but you know that your brain understands, like once you say squeeze your butt, your brain releases hands to the table, feet up, stomach in. It releases the whole muscle pattern.
And I can, like, feel it. I just wanna say that, like, even just saying it now, like, my body, like, automatically goes into this, like, feeling, and I almost get a little bit of, like, heart racing, like, "Ooh, I'm belting."
I'm gonna vault. I'm gonna vault. So what we like them to do is come up with keywords at least on all the major skills. So you don't necessarily have to have a keyword for every single piece of your floor routine and every single piece of your beam routine. And you maybe don't need a keyword for your kip or, whatever it might be, but come up with it for all the major skills. Um, and that is the what we like to give them the assignment to do for this week is to write down your routines with the major skills and then practice this, come up and like this is the time where we're experimenting and then come up with a keyword for each major skill. So last week we came up with an affirmation for each event. Now we're coming up with a keyword for each skill and then we're going to put it all together next week into our mental choreography.